Welcome to this podcast. I'm Dr. Rajeev Kurapati. We have with us Professor Salvatore Babones, an American sociologist living in Sydney, Australia, University of Sydney, Australia, if I'm not mistaken, since 2008.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sociologist, he has recently he had become more famous because of his straightforward talks on Indian democracy, both criticism and support of Indian democracy in many areas, which is what I liked about his conversation. But he's supportive of some of the things that they do in India, and also critical of some of the things. So that's the best part, not always picking a side. So welcome, Professor Salvatore Babones.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I want to talk about two things. You recently mentioned, I listened to that short video you put up on YouTube about the roots of Western civilization are to be found in India. I want to take this concept, expand that a little bit, see where we go. I know you mentioned to me that you are not a researcher or an academician on it, but you would like to speculate and have a fun conversation or a serious conversation, depending on how we go on this topic. So tell me a little bit about this is huge. This is a big deal. When you say the roots of Western civilization are to be found in India, it's going to raise a lot of eyebrows, right? So because
mine included,
always we have growing up in India, we were taught that is nothing really worthy of Indian philosophies or Indian civilizations.
No, I'm sure that's not. I'm sure that's an overstatement. I mean, certainly Indians are very proud of their civilization, and the whole world knows of Indian philosophy. So I can't believe that Indians are unaware of Indian philosophy. But
what I meant was, when you actually go to schools and read the books, what you are taught is not what you are told at home.
Okay.
So you see a dichotomy there, where we understand that Indians are great civilizations and long history and so on and so forth. But when you actually look at the books, textbooks, history books and things like that, growing up in India, you don't really get that. For instance, philosophy. When you look at philosophy books, mainstream philosophy, the things that you are exposed or you mostly read in mainstream philosophy is the philosophy of the Plato, the Socrates, starting from that. And then the Enlightenment philosophers, and then you come to the modernism, postmodernism, phenomenology, and so see how I'm, without even living in the West, I'm able to say all these things. But you come to Western, or not, let me put it this way. But when ask a average Indian, tell me something about Indian philosophy. I'm not talking about Vedanta. I'm not talking about rituals, the pujas and the festivals and things like that. Critical thinking. Tell me something about critical thinking that India has produced. I don't think you get a good response from them. But my question is, you started off with this, the roots of Western civilization are to be found. Expand what makes you think.
Let me start by saying I'm really happy to hear that Western civilization is still alive and well in India, because here in the West, Western civilization is universally disparaged. We hear that the ancient Greeks are racists and sexist, and there's nothing good to say about Western civilization. We are a very self-critical society. But the occasion for my talk about the roots of Western civilization being in India was the International Gita Mahotsav, which was held earlier this month in May in Sydney, Australia. And I was really honored to be invited to speak at that. And I thought, what should I speak on? I'm not an expert on the Bhagavad Gita. I don't read Sanskrit. I really am out of my depth in speaking at a celebration of the Bhagavad Gita. And so I thought, but what I do know about is Western civilization and some of the connections that are very little known and little understood between Western civilization and Indian civilization. I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that India was at the center of the ancient world. Now, I say circumstantial evidence because the physical evidence doesn't survive from that era, and it especially doesn't survive in India. So, for example, if you think about it, we learn in school that the oldest civilizations in the world are the civilizations of ancient Sumeria in the Middle East, followed by ancient Egypt. But what are the chances that the two civilizations that are the very earliest are two civilizations that happen to have arisen in arid desert climates? That is quite a coincidence. Now, the reason for that coincidence is that the materials survived in those environments precisely because they were arid desert environments. So we still have papyruses. I mean, paper essentially made from fiber from a plant. We still have papyruses from 6,000 years ago in Egypt. Yet Indian records written on palm leaves, well, how are those supposed to survive in an Indian climate for 6,000 years? So we don't have the physical evidence of Indian civilization going back 6,000 years. Instead, we have circumstantial evidence. So we have literary evidence that we can try to read into. We have the evidence of trade. So we know that those Near Eastern civilizations were trading with somewhere, and we can surmise that that somewhere was the same place they were trading with when we do have historical records, that is with Kerala and, with the west coast of India. So we're always reading through between the lines of this circumstantial evidence. Now, my own talk and follow-up article on this had to do specifically with the Ramayana as the origin, or as being much closer to the origin story for the Odyssey, the Greek story of the Odyssey, and also the Mahabharata being the origin story for the Iliad. Now, it's certainly no coincidence that we know that the North Indian, the Sanskrit-derived languages, are very closely related to ancient Greek. They're part of the same family of languages. We usually call it the Indo-European family of languages. It also includes Persian and Latin and the modern languages of Northern India and Western Europe. Well, what we don't know is where this language originated. Indic scholars argue passionately that this originated in Kashmir, what's today Kashmir. Western scholars tend to argue it arose in what's now Ukraine, somewhere near the Crimean Peninsula. I'm not an ethnolinguist. I'm not a paleobotanist. A lot of these arguments hinge on plants that are mentioned in the earliest records. So I can't adjudicate that, and I'm not going to try to adjudicate that. What I will say, however, is that the Mahabharata and the Ramayana seem to be much closer, just as a casual reader, not as a philologist, as a casual reader, they seem to be much closer to the spirit of an original series of Indo-European epics than the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, the fact that these are parallel, I mean, for any casual reader, it is just obvious, which is to say the Mahabharata is the great war epic of ancient Greece. The great hero Achilles is a warrior on a chariot. His one weak spot is his heel, the famous Achilles heel, and he's finally brought down by being shot through the heel with an arrow. This is obviously a parallel to Krishna in the Mahabharata, and similarly in the Ramayana, the great hero Rama is able to win his wife by being the only person who can draw the great bow. Well, the great hero Odysseus in the Odyssey is only able to win his wife because he can draw the great bow of Odysseus. I mean, the parallels are just remarkable. Okay, so whether the Indian story came first, whether they both came from some Indo-European origin, I'm not a philologist, and the philologists don't know. We're not going to adjudicate that. I do think, however, that the Indian stories seem to be much closer in spirit to an ancient original, which is to say that the Greek stories, the archaeologists tell us that the Greek stories have had places renamed, which is to say the story existed and then the places were attached to them. So, for example, the archaeologists tell us that there's no evidence for a Trojan War at Troy at the time that the Greek story locates the Trojan War in Troy. Now, there were many Trojan Wars, but was the Iliad originally a Mahabharata that was then location transferred to ancient Troy in what's now Turkey? I think that's very likely. Now, again, I can't speak to the historicity of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana any more than I can of the Iliad and the Odyssey. My impression, though, is that the Indians are closer to the original. And when we start thinking of it that way, we can think of the advice in the Bhagavad Gita as being very close to the spirit of Greek philosophy. So the emphasis on duty is very close to the spirit of, again, pre-Socratic Greek philosophy. I'm not talking about the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. I'm talking about the philosophies embodied in the Homeric epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, and that formed the pre-classical philosophy of ancient Greece, the traditional philosophies of ancient Greece. And the one passage that I cited specifically from the Bhagavad Gita was a passage about moderation. About if you're not, saying that if you're not a holy man, you should be moderate in prayer, moderate in sleep, moderate in diet. It's not right to spend, if you're not a holy man, you shouldn't be spending all day praying, even though the spiritual life is most important. Instead, you should fulfill your duty. If you're a warrior or Kastya in the Indian sense, then you should devote yourself to that. Right? If you're a Brahmin, if you're a leader, you should devote yourself to that. And in all other things, you should be moderate. Now, the idea that you should fulfill your duty and exercise moderation in all other things, not try to be everything, not to be extreme, that's at the very heart of Homeric values coming out of the Iliad. When Achilles, and the parallels between the Iliad and the Mahabharata, I really can't overstate them. Achilles withdraws from battle and refuses to participate in the carnage and is only persuaded to go back when his charioteer convinces him that it's his duty as a warrior to go back into the battle. Now, his charioteer, the particulars are different. His charioteer puts on Achilles' armor and gets killed, and only then does Achilles realize it was my duty to be in the battle, not the charioteer's duty to be in the battle. The particulars are different. But the idea that you have a story that's entirely motivated by the great warrior withdrawing from battle, but then learning from wise counsel that the duty of the warrior is to fight, even if fighting does bring about evil, even though it brings about death and destruction. That's the core of both of these stories. The connections seem very clear to me.
So for those who are not familiar with the Greek epics, if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit about, so we, growing up in India, we know what Mahabharata is, what Ramayana is, they are the itihasas, like as it happened, which means like Indian history. People believe that, I do too, that these happen. Tell us a little bit about this Greek side of the story, of the stories. Are those epics, they really happen? Are they stories? Are they novels? What are they?
Well, the ancient Greeks believed that the Greek epics were real historical records. Now, of course, Greece later became Christian. And when Greece became Christian, the status of the Greek epics was diminished from a record of history to a record of literature. And so modern Greeks, of course, don't believe the Greek epics happened literally, although most scholars believe that they are a reflection of things that actually happened, dimly remembered through the mists of time. The Greek epics that we have are the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're believed by linguists. Again, I'm not a philologist. I'm not a linguist. They're believed by philologists to have been composed in verse in their current form around 800 BC. No one knows for sure. They were oral tradition epic poems that later were written down towards the 6th century BC, and then they were copied. So even the ones we have now are not the versions that were written down in the 6th century BC. We have multiple manuscripts of them that derive from those 6th century BC manuscripts. Okay, Homer is the legendary author of these two epics. We know nothing about him except he's legendarily supposed to have been blind. The philologists dispute whether these two epics were written by a single person, whether the two epics may have existed and then been turned into their current stories by a single person, or whether Homer is just an imaginary person. We have no historical evidence for the existence of Homer. The two epics are the great war epic, the Iliad. The Iliad tells the story of the 9-year siege of Troy, when the armies from all over Greece came to Troy. Troy is a city, a historical city in what's now the western part of Turkey. And it's been discovered, and there have been archaeological excavations there. They went to Troy in a siege of Troy because the maiden Helen had been abducted from Greece and brought to Troy. And if you've heard the story of the golden apple, where the three goddesses give Paris the choice, would you rather have, and each goddess offers him something, and Venus, the goddess of love, Aphrodite, offers him the golden apple. Offers him the woman of his choice if he'll give her the golden apple, and he chooses that, and he gets Helen. That starts the war. All that's before the epic, though. That's the background for the epic. The epic tells the story in 400 pages or so of modern verse, tells the story of the great hero Achilles feeling slighted because he had won or felt he deserved to have a bride, Briseis, and that bride is denied to him, and his king, Agamemnon, takes the bride. And Achilles, in a huff, withdraws from the fight and says, why should I do all this killing when I'm not even getting my bride for it? Now, I don't want to offend any Indian sensibilities, but in the Mahabharata, the parallel here is the Sita and Rama deserving Sita, but Sita being taken away from him. Right? So then we have Achilles withdraws from battle. There's lots of carnage in the battlefield. He sees his friends dying. His friends all say to him, or the wise men say to him, Achilles, you should be here. Your friends are dying without you. If you don't join the fight, we're going to lose the war. Achilles says, it's not my responsibility to win this war, until he eventually realizes, this wise man Nestor explains to his charioteer. It's not the charioteer himself. It's the wise man explaining to the charioteer, the duty of a warrior is to fight, and Achilles must join the battle because that's the duty of a warrior. And then it's actually the charioteer who goes out in battle as wearing Achilles' armor. He gets killed, and Achilles then goes out into battle at last, wins the battle, kills the Trojan.
So the charioteer here he's not a philosopher.
No, the charioteer goes to talk to the philosopher.
Like Krishna is the charioteer. Krishna.
Yeah. I know. In the Indian epic, the charioteer is the philosopher. In the Greek epic, the charioteer goes to talk to the philosopher and brings back the message. Not an exact parallel. I'm just saying that for two books that supposedly have nothing to do with each other, that's a lot of parallel.
Yeah.
In the Odyssey is the great Greek travel log. So the Odyssey occurs after the Trojan War, just as I believe the Ramayana occurs after the Mahabharata. If I have my, I don't know.
Ramayana occurs first.
Comes first. All right. I may have it. If I have it wrong, I have it wrong. I apologize. So the Odyssey occurs immediately after the Great War. The hero Odysseus is trying to get home to his wife, and he has to travel through all sorts of challenges in order to finally get home to his wife and win his wife. And he travels all around the Mediterranean. He goes to the underworld to face the souls of the dead in the underworld, and in a way like Rama going to Lanka, to the underworld. And ultimately, when he arrives back home, he must, to prove that he really is Odysseus, he must, and it's at the end of the story, not at the beginning, he must lift the great bow and draw it that no other hero could possibly draw this bow.
Okay.
But he draws the bow to show that he is Odysseus. And then, unlike in the Indian epic, he then slaughters all the other. As soon as he draws the great bow, and then with one arrow, it goes through all the 12 other people who want to take his wife, and he returns. These are obviously not identical stories in any way whatsoever. But when we put this in context, that we know that Indian and Greek civilization are related by language. We absolutely know that the Mahabharata, Maha in Sanskrit is mega in Greek, because they're very closely related languages. The Mahabharata and Ramayana share these core elements. The whole stories are different. If you look for particulars, they're entirely different. But the core elements are remarkably parallel. The environment is parallel. These are stories about Bronze Age charioteers. So there's Bronze Age people whose primary weapons are the lance and the bow. So they shoot their arrows and then they get on their chariots and they, throw spears and lance each other from their chariots. If you see any of these souvenir Indian chariots with Rama on it, you will see, if you go to Greece, you'll see souvenir Greek chariots with Achilles on them that look identical. It's funny how the tourist, even the tourism, tourist trinkets have converged. So look, I can't tell you as a scholar, as an academic, that these are related. There's been various scholarly articles suggesting a relationship. Scholars have to be very careful. I'm not a scholar in this area. I'm just a person who enjoys reading, and I think the parallels are remarkable.
Since you seem to know a lot more than we Indians do about these Greek epics. So if you look at Ramayana and Mahabharata, they're not just war stories. They're not about one person abducting other person's wife or lover. There is a deeper dharmic, there is a dharma, that there's a bigger, deeper message. There is a lot about ethics, a lot about relationship, a lot about dharma in it. What binds the society? You are a social, what binds the society together? Is there something like that in the Greek ethics?
Absolutely. So ancient Greeks considered these two Homeric epics to be the guide to life. That is, they were taught to children as, how should you behave in society? Well, here is the story from the Iliad. Here's the story from the Odyssey. That is, until Christianity came to Greece, they were the moral guide for the Greek peoples. Now, what you won't find in the Iliad and Odyssey are the interpolations. And forgive me, I know Indians may be offended by this, but take the Bhagavad Gita, for example. The actual Bhagavad Gita we have, if you're reading the Mahabharata, this is an interpolation, right? The actual Bhagavad Gita we have is, okay, let's set the action aside for a minute and let's have this discussion, and it's a very extended discussion. I think if you imagine, now if you take these stories to be absolutely, transcribed from the heavens, then obviously, just like Christians feel about the Bible, we can't have this discussion. But if we view it as literature, if I were to imagine a group of very primitive Bronze Age tribes and their original story, I find it hard to believe that the Bhagavad Gita would have been in that original story. Right. I interpret that instead as there's an original story that represents the heart of the matter, and then a great sage inserted the Bhagavad Gita into it to further explain the principles that are there, right? The principles are in the original, but people wanted an explanation. And so you put the explanation in, and the God provides the wisdom to comment on what's in the original story, with the result that the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are enormous texts because there's so much interpolation into it. The Greek texts don't have that. So in the Greek texts, there's the story, but it's much more fast-paced. The lessons are implicit. So you learn the lesson by reading the story in a parable sense and then understand what your duty is. However, there's still the very strong emphasis on what Indians would call dharma, what Westerners would call duty. There's a sense that different people in different roles in society have different duties to perform in society. There's a sense of a society in which the highest honor you can have is not like in Christian society. The highest honor you can have is to adore God. Instead, there's a much older idea. The highest honor you can have is to perform your duty well, whatever your duty may be. That's what you would get from the classical Greek source. Yes, I think it's very similar. If you read the Iliad, you'll feel the spirit that is better elaborated in India, right? In the Indian epics, these are brought out, elaborated, commented on extensively. In the Greek epics, they're just lessons from stories, and you would learn a lesson from the story. And in fact, the ancient Greek philosophers would point to the Iliad and Odyssey and say, well, just as Achilles did this, just as Odysseus did that, you should learn from that, and then expand on it. But the expanded Greek commentaries are not part of the stories. They're separate commentaries by known historical philosophers of the 5th, 6th, 5th, and 4th century. Now, remember, in India, we don't know the names of anybody who contributed in the 5th, 6th, 5th, and 4th century BC, because, again, those immediate records have been lost because they weren't preserved on stone tablets in a desert, or in the Greek sense, they weren't preserved in scriptoriums that were then rewritten. We don't have the preserved records from the 5th century BC India. We know that 5th century BC Indians wrote. We know they were literate. We know there would have been philosophers who wrote things down. We still have some record. My own guess is we still have a record of what they wrote in our existing texts of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, but we don't have the originals, right? So if I were just to take a naive best guess as a non-expert to what happened in India you have the original epics, you have the philosophers' commentaries on them, the sages' commentaries on them, but what we have is that complete package in what ultimately came to be written and transmitted as our versions, the multiple authoritative versions of these epics. And it's important to remember we have multiple Mahabharatas, multiple Ramayanas, and the reason is there were originals, we just don't have those originals.
Yeah, so super interesting conversation, because when you start looking at the parallels, that's one interesting part. The second is you look at Mahabharata and you zoom in on Bhagavad Gita, and there are many such teachings within Mahabharata. For example, Vidura Niti. Vidura is one of the ministers of Dhritarashtra, the blind king. His brother is actually his minister. His name is Vidura, and he actually gives what we call Vidura Niti, and it's a set of instructions for the do's, don'ts, and all kinds of dharma, and how to lead a dharmic life, how you should not commit papa and things like that. And at one point, Dhritarashtra, the blind king, says, Janami dharmam nachame pravrutti, janami adharmam janami dharmam nachame pravrutti, janami adharmam nachame nivrutti. I know what is true, what should be done, but I cannot stay away from doing the papa or the sin. I also know what should not be done, but I cannot stay away from doing it. So things like this are impregnated at many places throughout the Mahabharata. And of course, Bhagavad Gita became very famous because Krishna, the highest philosopher, actually taught it. And there are many other places throughout Mahabharata that you can pick out and make it like another Gita. Like there is a Uddhava Gita. And so there are many Gitas within Mahabharata. So I don't know if, by the way, another interesting thing is Mahabharata, you have the Vedas, right? So the primary texts of Hindus are the Vedas, Rig Veda, Sama Veda, Yajur Veda, and Atharvana Veda. So the 4 Vedas. And then because they were studied by scholars and Brahmins of that age, they're not easily accessible to the common man. And therefore, these books or these itihasas were taught or were written down by those respective philosophers of Valmiki and Vyasa, respectively. So you have these Mahabharata and Ramayana, which is part of a much bigger literature of works. Is that something similar in Greek philosophy? Is one question. So let me finish a related question. Are these preserved in their original language, the Greek philosophy, like how Sanskrit was preserved in?
So we have as a no and a yes. So on the second question, we do have the archaic Greek of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are not in classical Greek. They're in archaic Greek that predates the classical Greek of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, so we do have that. What we don't have is that extended range of commentaries from the archaic period. But I'd like to ask, and again, I don't mean to be disrespectful of anybody's religion. I'm coming to this as an atheist and as a neutral commentator, and I mean no disrespect to anybody. When I read the Bhagavad Gita, I think it's again, as a secular, I don't mean to be disrespectful.
No,
I
you're
would
not.
read it.
Yeah.
I would read it as there's an ancient epic that comes down from the ancient Indo-European peoples who primarily were what we think of now as the Sanskrit-speaking ancient Indians. And then in the 6th century or the 5th century BC, a philosopher inserted into that a commentary on it, putting the words in the mouth of the god Krishna. Okay. I'm an atheist. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I personally don't believe that the god Krishna actually went and talked to people and gave them this dialogue. Okay. But if you see it in this secular way, if we imagine that there's an ancient Indian epic, and in the 5th century, an unknown philosopher wrote a dialogue that was then inserted into this epic. Imagine the parallel in Greece. In Greece, we have this ancient epic, and we have 5th century philosophers like Plato. If anyone's ever read Plato, almost all of Plato is structured as dialogues. They're structured as dialogues with people who are no longer alive, so most of them are with Socrates. Now, Socrates was an historical figure, but Plato's dialogues involving Socrates aren't a record of an actual conversation. He's using Socrates because Socrates is an authority figure. Everyone knows Socrates is a great philosopher. So who am I going to put in my dialogue? I'll put Socrates in my dialogue. And so we have a series of dialogues in which Plato imagines someone going to Socrates for advice and Socrates giving directives. Now, if we imagine that instead of all of that 5th century Greek material surviving, imagine it was all written on palm leaves and it all disintegrated and all disappeared. We could imagine that by the time we have by the time the Romans come around, by the 1st century BC, 400 years later, these Platonic dialogues might have been integrated into the oral tradition of the Iliad and Odyssey. And that's how I would imagine things happen. That we have this very parallel development. The Greek philosophers are using dialogues, generally dialogues with Socrates, but also dialogues with gods. They're using these dialogues with kings. But in Greece, we have the ancient epics, which were frozen as soon as they were written down, 6th century BC, and the dialogues are separate. In India, we have the ancient epics, which continued to evolve because they didn't take their final written form until much later, 2nd or 1st century BC, 400, 500 years later. So we have this parallel development in my mind, but those dialogues ended up in different places in Greece versus in India.
Here is a question to challenge you politely and with all humility, okay? I read this 5th century and 6th century. All history stops there, 5th century BC. When you look at any Indian book, Buddha was born in 5th century BC. Shintoism or some of the Chinese philosophers, they were born in 5th or 6th century. Somebody inserted Bhagavad Gita. It's a speculation, but 5th or 6th century. What is so special about the 5th or 6th century BC? Is it because it has been passed on and our mind is conditioned to think that is how far back we can go?
Yeah. So I'm a skeptic here. The philosophers and the romanticists talk about an actual age, this time when all this magic happened, these incredible figures, 5th century and all these places. But I look at it and I say, when did people start writing? Well, they first started writing, around, and I don't mean cuneiform, I mean actual, able to produce literature. The writing we have in these societies, let's leave Mesopotamia aside, these ancient forms of writing like hieroglyphics and cuneiform, they died out. Okay, the kinds of writing that continued into the present day, Chinese characters, Western alphabet, Sanskrit alphabet. When did these things first start becoming common in the cultures we're studying? Yeah, around the 6th century BC. The very first writing is 8th century BC. And then by the 6th century BC, societies are becoming literate. 5th century, they're fully literate. As a secular atheist, I suspect there were many Buddhas before the Buddha. But people were able to write down what the Buddha said because writing existed. And the great sages who existed in India before the 5th century BC, they're legends, right? We know of them. Their legends carry forward. Their thoughts may have been incorporated into poetry to become part of an epic poem, but we don't know them as philosophers because they weren't written down. I think it's no coincidence that our first known named philosophers occur at the same time that widespread literacy occurs in these societies.
Let me ask you this. So, not completely related to Indian, well, I am of the opinion that Zoroastrianism also was part of the Persian, Indo,
Yes.
Belonging to that kind of subcontinent where, Indo-Iranian and those part.
Yeah.
And Zoroastrianism also evolved somewhere as an offshoot, like a branch off of the Vedic culture of the rishis and the sages living in that area. And Zarathustra or Zoroaster was actually one of the sages who actually, like a Buddha of Buddhism, Zoroaster was the Buddha of Zoroastrianism.
And arguably Christianity as well, but we can get to that.
Yeah. But if you ask Zoroastrians, they disagree that, if you look at the Western dating of Zoroaster, they would say somewhere around, again, 5th or 6th century. But as Zoroastrianism, the people who belong to that faith, they would say he is actually 6,000 years old, 6,000 years BC. And I'm writing a book on some of the Indian philosophies. And in that, as part of my research, I think Plato at one point, somebody might have said that Plato said that, but Plato at some point was said to have referenced Zoroaster as belonging to 6,000 BC. So is it possible that, like you said, there was oral transmission for a long time? And like around 5th or 6th century BC, when written script developed, and that's when people started attributing the origins of these people to that age, when in fact they belong to a much older age, and their disciples took their name, and so on. I'm kind of speculating here. So
look, I know virtually nothing about Zoroastrianism. What I do want to remind people is that the expert consensus that we see in our textbooks is based on a very narrow film of primary source information. So I'll just give you an example that I've joked about myself, and that I wrote a kind of humor article about, the story of the Trojan horse. Okay. We only know about the story of the Trojan horse being ancient Greek from a single line. One line in the Odyssey says Odyssey famous for the horse. Oh, I'm sorry, Odysseus, famous of the Trojan horse. That's it. Other than that, we have no record of that story until 500 years later, when Virgil writes the Aeneid in ancient Rome. Okay, so the story had circulated. Now, it's been speculated, and I've speculated in writing, that the Trojan horse story is actually a dim memory of the Indian elephant in the jungle story, with the soldiers hidden in the belly of the elephant. And it all makes much more sense. I mean, hiding 6 soldiers in the belly of a fake elephant deep in the jungle foliage is much more credible than the Greek story, which is the Greeks built a giant horse and left it at Troy after 9 years of battle as we're sorry we attacked you. Here's this horse, please forgive us. And the Trojans pull that horse into the city. And then that night, 100 Greek troops rush out of the belly of the horse. Imagine the size of this horse with 100. Okay. Now, if we didn't have that one line from the Odyssey, everyone would assume that the Indian story comes first. But the scholars instead assume that the Indian story comes from the Trojan horse, and that it came through Alexander's armies. And when Alexander's armies came to India, then there were many Greek administrators who stayed and who then were incorporated. Okay, well, we don't know which source is older. What we know is that the written Indian source dates from later than this one line in the Odyssey. However, was the one line in the Odyssey interpolated in later? Who knows, right? Because we don't have a 6th century BC copy of the Odyssey. We have copies of copies of copies, right? That, so if you take away this one tiny shred of evidence, then the same academic articles that say that the Indian elephant story is derived from the Trojan horse story, they would all flip because our evidence is so thin. So on Zoroaster, was Zoroaster a historical figure at what era, at what age and time? Again, I would suspect that just as with these Greek stories, our historical sources are very thin. And I mentioned Jesus and Christianity. Look, I think if you were to guess where Christianity comes from, I'm not the first person to speculate on this. The 3 wise men came from the East. Where in the East? We don't know, right? They came from the East. And then Jesus, when he reached puberty, disappears for 15 years. Right. Where did Jesus go? To find wisdom? Did he go to the East to find wisdom? That seems very likely. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. Christians dismiss the idea. Why should they dismiss it? I mean, what's wrong with Jesus traveling in India and coming back a much wiser man and starting his ministry? Because we know that Jesus started his ministry after disappearing for 15 or 18 years.
I think 14.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever the number. So, I mean, theology is not
matter.
I'm just saying that our sources are so thin that we really have to recede back to what sounds like a credible story, right? I mean, what makes sense? So, for example, again, I'm sorry to go so far abroad on this, economic networks. I've been working on, and it'll be a long time before I can write it because it's a lot of research, but I'm working on redeveloping the idea of where was the economic center of the ancient world. We all assume there were 2 big centers, Mesopotamia and China. China was the middle kingdom, right? And Mesopotamia. But we mainly think that because we have surviving records. And if you look at later history, the economic center of Eurasia, from every point at which we have data, was India, right? So there was trade between India and the East. That's why you find Hindu references to Hinduism all the way out to Bali. All of Southeast Asia and all the way out to Indonesia were once Hindu influenced. We have Buddhism in Mongolia, in China, right? So we have this strong circumstantial evidence that ancient India was strongly connected there. We know that the gold trade in Alexandria and the trade in precious spice, the spice trade in Alexandria was primarily from spices that came from Kerala via the Red Sea into Alexandria. We even know that the ancient Egyptians built a canal from literally a canal. I mean, most people aren't aware of this. We have the archaeological evidence. This isn't just a fancy story. They built a canal from the Red Sea to the Nile to facilitate trade. Well, not to facilitate their Hajj to Mecca. That wouldn't happen for another 1,000 years. They built that canal to facilitate trade between India and Egypt. Right. So we have all this circumstantial evidence.
How far ancient, when you say ancient, how far back are you going in time?
Well, I can tell you in a second. I have to Google that one. We're talking in the Pharaonic age. So very quickly, the Canal of the Pharaohs. Again, you can just Google it. It's there on Wikipedia. It ran until historical times. That is until it ran from nearly 2000 BC up until 767 AD. And it was finally closed in 767. That is, it was closed in the Muslim era of Egypt. But it ran
BC.
It ran from, they say, again, I'm just taking you what's on Wikipedia here, 1878 to 1839. So 1800s BC, the canal is already being referenced.
That's a long time.
So no one knows when it was first built, but thousands of years ago, we know when it was closed, that it was closed in the 8th century AD.
So your hypothesis that you're developing that India, it's possible that India could be the epicenter of economic development for for the entire civilizations. Your hypothesis is based on archaeological evidence or circumstantial evidence?
Circumstantial evidence. And that's why this is so difficult, because we don't have the records for India. But the fact that we don't have the records doesn't mean that something didn't happen. And so the argument is circumstantial on the basis that from the point when we do have the records, trade with India was extensive. So we do have medieval era records. We know that trade, I mean, the reason Islam came to India was there was extensive trade between what's now the Middle East and India. Okay. We know, if we go back in time, we know that there were strong religious connections. So we can see somehow Hinduism got to Bali, somehow Buddhism got to Beijing, right? So we know there were networks. Now, we don't know how dense those networks are, again, because we simply don't have the written records. But somehow enough Buddhism got to China to create a massive Buddhist community, and at times entire Buddhist emperor, even Buddhist emperors in China, if you go back 1,500 years. So we have lots of circumstantial evidence. Now, the evidence for India and the West is even more circumstantial. There was this canal. There was, the wealthiest city in the ancient world was reputed to be Alexandria, based on trade with the East. How far east? We often assume that it's trade with Mesopotamia. That is our imagination. Western history is taught starting in Mesopotamia and expanding from there.
So this idea of ancient India is very debatable, because there is no concept of this boundary called India at that time, right? So there is this subcontinent. Most of historians talk about this subcontinent of Indian subcontinent, which kind of extends from somewhere in the east, from Mongolia, from China, parts of the current Russia, and then all the way extending into the Afghanistan and into maybe Turkey if you stretch a little bit, maybe not. So this kind of broad Indian subcontinent, that makes it hard for someone like you who want to make a case for, well, the epicenter was in India, but then what India are you talking about? Are you talking about the India that is the Turkey or the Afghanistan part of India? So how do you make a case for that kind of critique?
Look, there wasn't a modern nation state of India, and anyone who wants to connect it to the modern nation state of India, that's just romanticism. There was an area of the world that roughly corresponds to what is today India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, that was very highly economically developed, that seems to have been a source for many of the world's major religions, that we have good circumstantial evidence was highly prosperous. Now, whether it was the oldest, who knows? I ask Indians, what's the oldest city in the world? Varanasi. Okay. I ask a Western textbook, it says Ur in Mesopotamia. Now, Ur was in a desert. It's still there. And it's outside the modern cities. It's not in the middle of Baghdad. Yeah. It's out in the desert. Yeah. Now, is it just a coincidence that the oldest city we know of is in a good preservation environment outside of modern cities? Yeah. I don't think so. And I've actually written about this seriously. So 10,000 BC, which is when Ur existed, we actually know from geology that the Persian Gulf was much smaller. It was only about half of its current size. It had been all silted up. I'm sorry, since then, sea levels were much lower, 10,000 BC, because 10,000 BC, there were still glaciers in Europe. Okay. Since 10,000 BC, the level of the Persian Gulf has risen so much that the Persian Gulf has doubled in size. Now, if I had to imagine where the great city of ancient Sumeria would it have been in a landlocked interior desert area? Or would the greatest city of ancient Sumer have been right at the output of the Euphrates River on the Persian Gulf? I strongly suspect that the most ancient city of ancient Mesopotamia would have been at the outlet of the Tigris-Euphrates River in the Persian Gulf. Everything we know about the ancient world is that people built things on rivers, right? That trade was important. Well, if that place was where the ancient capital of Sumeria was more than 10,000 years ago, it would now be under 100 meters of water and then under meters of silt. No one's going to know it's there. Okay. Now, I can't say that's where it is, right? I'm not going to go lead an expedition, try to do deep sea archaeology. I'm saying if we just think credibly, we have to remember that 10,000 BC, sea levels are much lower. I mean, we know this in India, that what are now coastal cities in India were actually inland areas in 10,000 BC. Are the greatest cities of ancient India now underwater? I mean, we know that Sri Lanka was connected to India until historical times, right? I mean, and we just forget that the world has changed. Now, so if we want to imagine this ancient world, we have to imagine it using our, imaginations. We have to think what would be a credible story. I mean, let me give you a controversial story that has nothing to do with India. Okay. The current archaeology of the United Kingdom is all about archaeological finds of things that are on land in the UK. And they're investigating the Stone Age Britain, Stonehenge, all of these things from 5,000 to 10,000 BC. Yet at 5,000 to 10,000 BC, sea level was lower, and what's now the North Sea was actually a big Great Plain. Okay. If I were to imagine, where were most of the ancient British people living in 10,000 BC? They were probably living in what's now the Dogger Banks. Now, in fact, they keep dredging up artifacts, Stone Age artifacts, arrowheads, etc. When they go to the Dogger Banks, which is a big fishing ground, they put out their dredge nets, and they for a couple hundred years, they've been pulling up Stone Age artifacts. We know that people lived there. Now, I would think credibly, today, almost everyone lives within 100 kilometers of the ocean, right? I mean, population of the world is extraordinarily concentrated within 100K of the ocean. Sydney's on the ocean, Melbourne's on the ocean, Brisbane's on the ocean. Well, don't we think our ancestors would have lived on the ocean? And if we believe our ancestors would have lived on the ocean, then what we see today are the hillbillies, the highland backwater or backcountry people. So we're getting records of people who were the backcountry edges of civilization. All the original key areas of civilization are 100 meters underwater because sea levels have risen. Now, once you start thinking in those terms, that shifts your perspective on things. So, no, I don't know that ancient India was the cradle of civilization, the center of world trade. I find it unlikely that our first writing and our first glimmers of city life occurred in a remote desert. It just seems very unlikely. It seems much more likely that the most civilized people of 10,000 BC lived along the sea or on rivers, were actively trading through networks, internationally, quote unquote, long distance trading. That's a much more likely story. Now, if that's a likely story, where were those people in ancient Sumer trading with out of the Persian Gulf? Well, obviously, they were trading out the Persian Gulf to India. Now, that implies that there were people in India to trade with, right? That Indians had something to offer them. So all of this is circumstantial. All of it is based on credible guesses. I can't substantiate any of it. I'm not a paleoarchaeologist. I'm not. This is not my area. I'm a sociologist, and primarily an economic sociologist, who's taking what we know from historical eras and trying to reconstruct a credible prehistoric era. The current vision we have of prehistoric history of the prehistoric world is just not credible. It doesn't make sense. Now, was India the center? I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Can I prove it? No. Am I ever going to prove it? No. Is this my mission in life? Absolutely not. This is something I enjoy speculating about. It's a lot of fun. It's a great party topic, and it's provocative. It's something that should give us pause to think, how did this happen? And I think the answers are not obvious, but we can make some reasonable guesses.
Yeah. Speculation is good because that's how hypotheses are built, and then you either find evidence to prove or disprove it, and then you end up with theories based on that. So, whether somebody's going to prove your hypothesis or not, that's the future generations will have to work on that. But then this is a shift in thinking from where it was taught that most of the knowledge came from outside to India versus now the knowledge. It's possible that the knowledge has risen, or at least civilizations or organized societies. See, you are a sociologist. I Googled who is a sociologist just before I logged in. An expert in development, structure, and function of human societies. That's a sociologist. That's a big deal because the more I think about sociologists, the more I feel like they're one of the most important underpinnings of, that's because, for instance, take my profession, medical profession, right? So you want to know how to provide equitable services, medical services to the members of the society, to the economic spread or different economic spread of the society. And who do you go to? Who is your minister? If you're a king, who is your minister to go to? So somebody who has some training in sociology would come and say, hey, societies are built like this. Societies are structured this way. This is by societies meaning people are built this way, structured this way, and then this is how you provide medical. Am I saying it right? I'm talking completely ignorant in this field, but based on my
That's classical sociology. Auguste Comte, who's the French philosopher who coined the word sociology, viewed sociology as an integrative social science, that it would take these pieces from other parts of knowledge and bring them into a unified narrative of society. I'm very much educated in that tradition. I very much aspire to be that kind of sociologist. That's not the center of gravity of sociology today. So just to be very frank, most sociology today focuses on very narrow issues of class differences, racial differences, gender differences. And the field has just evolved in that direction. But if you think of classical sociologists, the two most famous ones are Emile Durkheim and Max Weber, and they're I very much look to them as lodestars of what sociology should be. Thinking about these big questions.
Who are they?
Emile Durkheim. Yeah, Emile Durkheim was the first actual professor of sociology. He founded the first sociology journal. He was French. I could talk endlessly about Durkheim, but he established the basic methodological precepts of sociology. He's most famous for establishing the idea that sociology, at least social theory, should be conducted at the level of an emergent phenomenon, which is to say, we think of social facts as real. I think the famous phrase is social facts are real and real in their consequences. Now, an emergent phenomenon is the idea that if you put any three dots on a blackboard, those three dots form a triangle automatically. I mean, unless they're in an exactly perfect line, they form a triangle. Well, they can't. I mean, the chances that you would be able to draw three dots in a literally straight line is infinitesimal. So any three dots form a triangle. But there's no triangle on the board. We see the triangle. It's an emergent phenomenon. It's an interpretation. What's there are three dots. Our interpretation is that they form a triangle. And in the same way, social facts are emergent phenomena. So if I think of a language, the Hindi language, is there such a thing as the Hindi language? No, I mean, well, let's not use Hindi. I don't speak Hindi. The English language. I have an English vocabulary. You have an English vocabulary. Someone else has an English vocabulary. The dictionary represents every word that has been said by somebody in English, but they don't form part of each of us have different vocabularies. The English language itself is an emergent phenomenon. There's no such thing. You can't touch the English language. The English language exists in its use between people. Right. So sociology was imagined by Durkheim as the science, or at least the attempt at science, of studying these emergent social phenomena, patterns in society. And I myself am very much a structuralist in the Durkheimian tradition, trying to examine social structures, as opposed to, I don't study groups in society. So, I don't do qualitative research on what do groups of people think about their world. I'm not an interpretivist. I'm very much a structuralist. I'm interested in how are facts correlated to each other in society. Max Weber is the other famous early sociologist. Max Weber is very famous for writing his book on China. So his study of China, but he is especially famous for his book Economy and Society, which laid out the field of what's now economic sociology. He also was the first sociologist to examine issues of political legitimacy and what made a government legitimate. And he was actually working on his book on political legitimacy when he died. So we never got that book. Instead, we have a bunch of essays and lectures on political legitimacy. So these are the two kind of giants of early sociology. Most classical sociology seminars would take Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and Karl Marx. Karl Marx is not really a sociologist, but so many sociologists take a Marxian perspective that he's been at. He very much was an economist, saw himself as an economist, but he's taught in sociology more than in economics these days. And that's the foundations of the field. The field has gone a very different direction in current times, but I'm very much in the classical sociological tradition.
I see. So we're getting close to the end of this conversation, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. One is when people have questions about, I know you're not an expert in this, but gender, let us say gender identity. Sure. The hot topic that's going on in the Supreme Court in India. Who do they approach other than doctors? Talking about the sex versus gender, the difference between so what is XY and XX chromosome and this and that. Yeah. So who do they approach? I mean, they're looking at books written by the Western. It's books written by the Western philosophers or the Western scholars and then trying to extrapolate or trying to impose that on Indian culture, because gender is so much about your own, how you grew up with, in the society that you grew up with.
When the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown was in her confirmation hearings, notoriously, one of the senators asked her, "Can you define woman?" And she dodged the question and she insisted, "I can't define woman. I'm not a biologist." And I said, "You're wrong. You can't define woman because you're not a sociologist." because these days, these definitions of woman and man, these are now become sociological as opposed to strictly biological. But humor aside, as a sociologist, what I'm very interested in is how these conversations around gender spread around the world, and why, for example, India is having this conversation. So again, I don't want to try to influence people's views on this. Instead, let me bring this back to my actual academic work. I've been studying Indian democracy, and I've been telling people that India has, by the standards of the developing world, by the standards of a country with a GDP per capita of $2,500, India has an extraordinarily well-institutionalized, highly liberal democracy. And people think I'm crazy about that. And then this perfect example comes up. India in 2023 is having a debate about gay marriage and whether gay marriage rights are implicit in the Indian constitution. Now, that debate was only had in the United States 6 years ago, right? I mean, whether you agree with gay marriage or don't agree with gay marriage, India is at most 10 years behind the curve set by the Netherlands, United States, and Australia. Australia got gay marriage in a referendum, I think it was 2018. Right? So if India is less than 10 years behind the curve of these highly advanced, developed, progressive, developed liberal democracies, I keep telling people by Western standards, not by Indian standards, it's for you to decide whether India is democratic by Indian standards. By Western standards, India is an extraordinarily liberal democracy. You can't find other developing countries with a GDP per capita under $5,000 per year who are having such a sophisticated debate. I mean, in Uganda, they've just made homosexuality illegal, punishable by death. Indonesia has just implemented Sharia law. Again, with homosexuality, I don't know if it's punishable by death, but it's certainly a crime. Indonesia, which is richer than India, is not having a sophisticated debate about gay marriage. India's having that sophisticated debate. Now, which way the debate goes is up to you guys. For me as a social scientist, the interesting fact is that the debate is happening, which indicates to me that India is a highly advanced liberal democracy. regardless of what the critics might say. Now, I talk to critics who say India doesn't have gay marriage yet, therefore India is a barbaric, regressive regime. And I say, that's crazy, because then you would have to say that in 2010, Australia was a regressive, barbaric, illiberal non-democracy, right? I mean, if you believe that Australia 2010 was a reasonably liberal democracy that respected people's rights, then whether or not India does embrace gay marriage, India today is at least an Australia 2010 democracy. And nobody was complaining about Australian democracy in 2010. So that's where I come into these debates. Whether India wants gay marriage or not is up to Indians. If
you listen to the Supreme Court hearings that are going on, it's very heartening to see the democracy at play. Where there's the two parties coming together with their own views, and then there's the judges sitting there and trying to, they may have their own agenda. The judges might have decided what would be the future course of action. Yeah. That's a different point. But at least there is some action that's going on in a democratic way. It's very heartening to see it.
Well, it's not democratic. It is liberal and rights-based. So the the Australian transition to gay marriage was democratic. Australia held a referendum. The referendum overwhelmingly endorsed gay marriage, and it was put in. In the US, as in India, it was an elite discourse. There were referendum after referendum in the United States was endorsing gay marriage until the Supreme Court stepped in and found it in the Constitution.
By that, you mean it's not people's voice, but it's
an elite liberal discourse.
A few selected people talking and trying to decide what's right for the entire 1.4 billion people.
Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say that that's right or wrong. I'm going to say that that's undemocratic. Right. So India's current gay marriage.
That is not undemocratic.
No, it is undemocratic. India's current gay marriage debate is an indication of India having a sophisticated, rights-based liberal democracy. It is not an indication of democracy.
That's interesting.
Because it's not democratic.
What would constitute a democracy?
If democracy means anything, it means people rule. Demos people, Krasi rule.
So in this gender, the gay marriage, whatever they're trying to work on, what would be a democratic way of achieving the end result?
Congress Party makes gay marriage a part of its election platform for 2024. It wins the election and it legislates gay marriage. That's a democratic mechanism to arrive at gay marriage. And that was happen, or the Australian mechanism. Have a referendum. Now, it wasn't a legal referendum in Australia. It was.
So what is a referendum for those who are not familiar with the legal terms?
In Australia, a referendum is a constitutional process through which a question is put to the people. And if the people answer a certain way in a popular vote, then the parliament will legislate based on the outcome. Australia didn't technically do a referendum. It did a plebiscite. So that's essentially just a postal question. The question was put to people without it being a legal referendum, but it was to gauge the spirit of the country. And Australia overwhelmingly expressed a view that Australians, it was 2-1, that Australians wanted gay marriage. And that's also a democratic mechanism. But you don't have anything that imposes a finding without reference to the people may be good. I want to separate people's idea that everything that's good is democracy, everything democratic is good. No. It may be good. It's not democratic.
Yeah. So why I wonder, this is not, I don't want to dwell too much into this discussion because neither of us are experts in this gender identity or gender law and things like that. But I wonder why India decided that a few elite individuals would get to decide what's right and what's wrong.
I don't think India decided that. It's lawyers, activist lawyers test the limit, and they should. I'm not using activist as a pejorative. Activist lawyers test the limits of how we conceive of rights. They saw that activist lawyers in the U.S. had made the argument that the rights embedded in the U.S. Constitution implied, through equal protection of the law, a right to gay marriage. Now, I disagree with that legal analysis. The U.S. Chief Justice disagreed with it. It only passed the Supreme Court in U.S. 5-4 with the Chief Justice on the dissent side. So when I say that I disagreed with it, it's not because I'm some radical lunatic. It's because I agree with the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in his analysis on this, that it's not to be found in the Constitution. However, the legal theory that it was to be found was persuasive to 5 out of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Well, in India, we have the same issue, that activist lawyers are arguing that implied in the rights in the Indian Constitution is the right of people to choose that if there's going to be marriage, they should not be restricted in their choice of which gender they're allowed to marry. So limiting marriage to only people of the opposite sex is an unconstitutional imposition. That may be. I'm not an Indian constitutional law expert. However, I suspect it's as in the U.S. that jurists are able to massage the actual words of the Constitution to find what they want to find. But there are many legal theories about this. I'm much more on the side of original intent, which is one set of legal theories that imply that the constitutions should be understood in the way that the people who framed them meant them. Other people think that constitutions should be evolving, that is the words are there, but we should attach new meanings to them. And these are both legitimate points of view. I mean, we've had this in the United States. For example, does the U.S. Constitution's right to keep and bear arms imply that people can own a nuclear missile? Well, that's an arm, but it wasn't an arm that was imagined in 1788. So we have a right to keep and bear arms. Yeah, well, you can have bows and arrows. You can have guns. Can you have artillery? No. And, well, you could make an argument. The words say I can have artillery, or you can make an argument that no, we have to apply those words in a new setting in new ways. Mm-hmm. And those are both legitimate arguments. Everybody has
written some many hundreds years, a few hundred.
Yeah, years. I mean, so when the Indian Constitution was written, and again, I'm not an expert on it, but I understand there are equal protection clauses in the Indian Constitution. Well, how would those be applied to the question of gay marriage? Is me choosing to marry someone of the opposite sex a personal choice that is not constitutionally protected? Or is it a right that is constitutionally protected? I can't give you the answer to that. These are legitimate questions. It is not illegitimate to arrive at gay marriage via a constitutional ruling. I simply say it is not a democratic process. It is a legal process, which may be good, may be bad. That depends on your point of view.
Yeah. For a common man like me in this area, this is super fascinating. So thanks for the tutorial little class on how things work in this field of sociology. Before we conclude, I don't want to miss this part. So you have started I guess a nonprofit, India Century Roundtable.
Not-for-profit think tank.
Tell us a little bit. Huh? Yeah.
Look, it's a not-for-profit think tank. We're starting here in Australia. We have a lot of big end of town support in Australia. The former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, is chairing our advisory board. The former chair of the Australian Stock Exchange and of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Maurice Newman, is chairing our board of directors. We are approaching Australian corporates and universities about becoming members. And the idea here is to be India focused, but Western facing. We want to provide an accurate fact-based narrative about India in the West. You would not believe the low levels of understanding of India that we get in our public discourse in places like Australia and the United States. Often it's based on what people learned in school in the 1970s that they're dimly remembering. So they still think that Indira Gandhi is the prime minister or something. There's a lot of it goes back to people thinking that India is what it was in the 19th century because they have a vague understanding of colonial India, and that still survives. So what we'd like to do is just provide a fact-based narrative. There's actually a lot of good survey data about India. There's a lot of bad data about India that's circulating. We just like to have experts go into these data, present it. We want to be very data-driven. I'm going to keep using that word data, not opinion-driven. So we're not looking to get people to give their opinions about Indian institutions. we're looking for people to describe them. So my first launch report was on the VDEM rankings, but it was a technical analysis of the quality, the technical measurement qualities of the VDEM rankings. This is my own area in quantitative sociology. We're commissioning a barrister to look at the collegium system in India. And again, not to endorse it, not a thumbs up or thumbs down on the collegium, but to explain it to a Western audience, because there's no good Western summary of how the collegium system works, how it compares to other countries. Is it in line with democratic norms? Is it out of line with democratic norms? Let's get just an analysis of it to bring to Western audiences. My next paper that I do next year will be on the press freedom rankings. And again, I'm just going to be going into the data on freedom of the press, data on security for journalists, and producing a report around it as a counter to the Reporters Sans Frontières report. Most of what we get about India is motivated by political considerations. People have a political axe to grind, whether that's Reporters Sans Frontières or Human Rights Watch or commentators in the Indian media. We want to get the facts out about India. So we've started up. We have a good support here in Australia. Of course, we're looking for donations. We have a GoFundMe up. I'm pro bono. I can't take, as long as I'm working at the University of Sydney, I can't take any money for what I'm doing. So I want to be clear to everybody, I get nothing. This is a service activity for me, something I'm really interested in doing, but it's not something I make any money from. All money goes to the research.
Yeah,
and we'll see how it goes.
I hope some of this actually starts to percolate into the mainstream media and gets into Washington Journal, New York Times, things like that. So hope you get more visibility out of it. I'll leave a link to the GoFundMe and other
thanks.
the website and other things on my description below. But the name is Indian Century Roundtable. Indian Century
Roundtable, and the name came from Tony Abbott, who has repeatedly said that if there is going to be a leader of the free world in the 21st century, it will be India. And he views this very much as India's century. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't go all the way with Tony Abbott on that. I'm an American. I'm very proud of the United States. And I think if there's going to be a free world in the 21st century, it's going to be a collaboration between two models of democracy, an American model and an Indian model. And that these are going to be the two great democracies that uphold democratic values in the world. But either way, both of us agree that this is not China's century. There's been a lot of talk that the 21st century will be China's century. I don't think the world has any appetite for becoming more like China. And if the developing world is going to go somewhere, it's going to look to India as a model, not to China as a model. And we'll see.
Very, very heartening to listen because
that's my own view. Of course, no one knows what will happen in 50 years, but I think most people in the developing world trying to think of what it would be to live a happy, fulfilling life in a good society are not looking to China for that. They're looking to China only for money. And I think that they will, as India itself becomes much richer, they'll increasingly look to India for ideas not only about making money, but ideas about democracy, ideas about freedom, ideas about enlightenment. I think this is India's time to shine.
Yeah.
And so the Indian Century Roundtable will put that light out to the rest of the world.
That's wonderful. So I hope, no disrespect, I hope Tony Abbott's prediction comes true. And if not, at least your prediction would come true in future. So with this, I think we'll conclude, and hopefully sometime. And there are so many things I've written. As a sociologist, how do you see the organization in India and things like that. So there are so many other things that I would like to talk about, but maybe for the next time. So this topic is super fascinating because I don't think you ever talked about the Iliad and Homer, all those things in any of your other talks.
No, it's just a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate having the opportunity. I have to stress, I'm speculating with all of that. The Indian democracy. Okay, I've become an expert. The Bhagavad Gita, take my views with a grain of salt. It's just speculation, but it's fun speculation.
Yeah, that these Bhagavad Gitas and Upanishads and Ramayana, the more you learn, there's a lot more you can get out of it. So it's like there's no complete 100% expert on these topics because they're poems, they're written in a poetic language, so you can extract, you can twist the text, squeeze, massage, test, torture, get different perspectives, different viewpoints, and plot this out of them. I'm so glad you are talking about Indian societies and being critical of both the good and bad of it, and hope people learn from this. People learn how to look at from a sociology standpoint, and hope we have another conversation like this. So thank you so much, Salvatore, for spending this time with me.
Oh, my great pleasure. Thanks for letting me just speculate. It's been a lot of fun.
Speculation is awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.